There is a room inside the Great Pyramid that no human being has ever entered. Not a legend, not a rumor, a confirmed empty space, roughly 30 meters long, sitting in total darkness above the Grand Gallery, sealed on every side by solid stone. No door, no corridor leading in, no corridor leading out. It has been sitting there, untouched, since before the invention of the wheel in most of the world. We know it is there because in 2017, a team of physicists did something nobody had thought to do. They stopped digging and started watching the sky. Cosmic rays strike the upper atmosphere constantly and produce particles called muons, and those particles rain down through everything, including 2.5 million blocks of limestone. Solid stone absorbs them. Empty air does not. So the team laid particle detectors inside the pyramid and simply waited, counting the particles that made it through. Where the count was too high, there was nothing there. And the count came back wrong in one place. Badly wrong. 3 separate teams, using 3 completely different detection technologies, working independently across 2 continents, all pointed at the same coordinates. Nuclear emulsion films from Nagoya University, scintillator detectors, gas detectors positioned outside the monument entirely. They all found the same hole in the middle of the largest stone structure on Earth. Then follow-up scans made it worse. The original estimate of 30 meters was a minimum. Later measurements pushed it toward 40 and confirmed that it was not a cluster of small gaps or settling cracks. It is one continuous space, a void the size of a passenger aircraft hidden inside a building that has been mapped, measured, tunneled into, and picked over by treasure hunters, armies, and archaeologists for more than 1,000 years. Nobody predicted it. No theory of pyramid construction called for it. The lead of the project said as much in public. They were not confirming something they expected. They found something nobody had any reason to look for. And here is the part that turns a discovery into a mystery. If that space were a construction feature, a gap left by the builders to relieve weight, it would look like the gaps we already know about. It does not. If it were a burial chamber, there would be an access route, because the ancient builders had to get in there in the first place. There isn't one. And if there is no way in and no way out, then either the entrance is still hidden, or the builders sealed something inside and made certain it would stay sealed. That is one anomaly. There are 3 more, and they get progressively harder to explain. There is a corridor behind the north face that nobody knew existed until 2023. There is a piece of wood pulled out of a shaft in 1872 that came back from the laboratory with a date that should not be possible. And there is what lies underneath the pyramid, in the bedrock, below the foundation, where a shaft descends into groundwater and a chamber was left deliberately unfinished. Start with the phrase, because before any of this was measured, it was written down. The Giza plateau had a name in the ancient records, and the name was not Giza. It was Rostau. Egyptologists translate it in different ways, but the meaning circles around the same idea every time. The mouth of the passages, the opening of the shafts, the place of the corridors leading down. Rostau appears in funerary texts as a subterranean region, a system of passages beneath the ground associated with a god of the deep places, whose domain was described as sealed, hidden, and inaccessible. The texts talk about the secret things of Rostau. They describe a locked region under the horizon that the living were not meant to reach. For a century and a half, that language was filed under religion, symbolic geography, a spiritual landscape of the afterlife that happened to borrow a place name. But that explanation has a problem. Rostau was not a metaphorical location. It was a real administrative place with real priests, real offerings, and a real physical address. And that address is the plateau the pyramids stand on. The Egyptians used the same word for a spiritual underworld and for the ground under their feet at Giza. That happens when the language of the sacred is built on top of something physical. And under that plateau, there are passages, real ones, cut into limestone bedrock, descending at precise angles, ending in chambers that have never been fully explained. The ancient scribes were not describing a fantasy. They were describing an address. Now, the first clue, and it is the one you can see with your own eyes if you buy a ticket and walk in. Go up through the Grand Gallery, duck through the low antechamber, and you enter the King's Chamber. The walls are red granite. The ceiling is red granite. 9 slabs of it, laid flat, each one weighing somewhere between 40 and 80 tons. That granite did not come from Giza. Giza sits on limestone. The nearest source of that specific red granite is Aswan, roughly 800 kilometers to the south. So every one of those blocks was quarried, extracted, moved to the river, floated north, hauled inland, and then lifted more than 50 meters into the air and set into position inside a structure that was still being built around it. That alone is the single most impressive engineering act of the ancient world. But it is not the strange part. The strange part is the surfaces. Granite is one of the hardest materials a person can work with. It contains quartz. The standard toolkit of the period was copper stone pounders, sand as an abrasive, and enormous amounts of labor. That combination works. It has been demonstrated experimentally. It is also extremely slow, and it leaves a characteristic finish. Some of the granite at Giza and the surrounding sites does not have that finish. In the 1880s, a surveyor spent months at Giza measuring everything he could reach with instruments accurate to fractions of a millimeter. He was not a fringe theorist. He was the man who effectively invented modern scientific archaeology, and he was a skeptic of every wild theory floating around at the time. He examined the granite and found cut surfaces with straight, regular striations running across them. He found evidence of sawing on blocks over 2 meters long, and he found drill cores, cylinders of granite, left over when a hole is bored out of a block. One of those cores is still preserved. It has a spiral groove running around it, cutting cleanly through both the soft and the hard mineral crystals in the stone, without deviating. He wrote that the tool marks implied a cutting method more capable than anything the standard reconstruction allowed for. Then he moved on, because he had nothing to compare it to. For decades, scholars dismissed the cores as an oddity, a misreading, damage from later handling. Modern experiments have shown copper tubes with sand slurry can indeed core granite, and that has settled the question for most researchers. But it has not settled the geometry. A copper and sand drill grinds. Grinding produces uneven, wandering marks because sand does not care whether it is passing over quartz or feldspar. A groove that cuts continuously through both at a consistent angle is the signature of a fixed cutting point under steady pressure. We do not have that tool. It has never been found, not in a workshop, not in a store's list, not in a single tomb painting out of the thousands that show Egyptian craftsmen at work in obsessive detail. Which means one of two things is true. Either the tool existed and every trace of it was removed, or the method was something we have not correctly imagined yet. That is the first anomaly you can touch. The second one you can only reach with a robot. If you have made it this far, subscribe, because the next 3 discoveries are the ones the mainstream press covered for exactly one day and then never mentioned again. Above the King's Chamber, stacked one on top of another, are 5 hollow spaces, rough granite beams, unfinished on the upper surfaces, separated by gaps. They are called relieving chambers, and the accepted explanation is structural, distributing the immense weight of the masonry above so it does not crush the room below. Fine. Except the topmost one has a gabled roof, which the others do not, and the void, found in 2017, sits well away from all of them. The scans specifically checked whether the big void connected to the relieving chambers or extended toward the summit. It did not. It is its own thing. Now, go down 1 level to the chamber below, the one traditionally called the Queen's Chamber. Two narrow shafts run out of that room, north and south, about 20 centimeters square. They are too small for a person. They do not reach the outside of the pyramid, and unlike the shafts in the King's Chamber, they were not even open. They were hidden behind the wall surface, invisible until 1872, when an engineer working on the plateau noticed a crack, pushed a rod into it, and felt the rod disappear into open space. He chiseled through and found two perfectly cut channels running off into the dark. Inside the northern one, he found three objects: a small stone sphere, a metal hook, and a fragment of cedar wood. Those three items are the only artifacts ever recovered from a sealed interior space of the Great Pyramid. Everything else was emptied long ago. These were behind a wall. The sphere and the hook went to the British Museum. The wood vanished. For nearly a century and a half, that piece of cedar was considered lost. Then, in 2020, a curator at the University of Aberdeen, going through boxes in a collection that had nothing to do with Egypt, opened a cigar tin. Inside were fragments of ancient wood. It had been donated decades earlier by a researcher with a family connection to the plateau, misfiled and forgotten in a building where nobody was looking for it. They radiocarbon dated it. The result came back between roughly 3,341 and 3,094 BCE. The pyramid is dated to around 2560 BCE. That wood is somewhere between 500 and 800 years older than the building it was found inside. The careful explanation is that the cedar was old wood reused, long-lived timber kept for generations, or an heirloom tool handle already ancient when it was dropped. That is genuinely plausible, and it is the explanation most specialists accept. But hold it next to the rest of the picture. Ancient timber, sealed behind a wall, in a shaft that leads nowhere and serves no known function, in a chamber that contains nothing. Nobody puts nothing at the end of a passage that took that much effort to cut. And in 1993, somebody finally sent a machine up there to look. A German engineer built a small tracked robot and drove it up the southern shaft more than 60 meters into the body of the pyramid, filming as it went. At the end of the climb, the camera lights hit something that was not stone rubble and was not a collapse. It was a slab, fitted, dressed flat, and set into the face of it were two small metal pins. Handles, or pins, for something to grip. Either way, worked metal, deliberately placed at the end of a 20-centimeter shaft, 60 meters inside a solid mountain of rock, where no human hand could ever have reached to install it after the fact. It went in as the pyramid was being built. The footage got out. The reaction from the authorities was immediate, and the engineer's access was terminated. He did not go back. It took 18 more years to get another look. In 2011, a new robot with a flexible camera on a bending arm was sent up. It drilled a small hole through the slab and pushed the lens into the space beyond. What it found was a small chamber, and on the floor were markings in red ochre paint. Marks that look like the shorthand notation Egyptian work crews used. Quick numerical or organizational tallies, scrawled where nobody was ever supposed to see them. The camera also swung around and looked at the back of the slab. The two metal pins continued through the stone and were bent into neat loops on the far side. Finished, tidied, deliberately terminated on the hidden face of a barrier nobody was ever meant to open. Then the project stopped. No follow-up expedition, no excavation, no published resolution. The most direct physical lead inside the Great Pyramid was opened by half a centimeter, photographed, and left exactly where it was. That is two anomalies. The third one is underneath everything, and it is the one that changes the shape of the story. Everyone knows the chambers inside the pyramid. Almost nobody talks about what is below it. From the original entrance, A passage runs downward at a steep, unwavering angle, not through the masonry, straight down into the bedrock of the plateau, cut through solid limestone for around 100 meters, holding its angle so consistently that surveyors found the deviation across its entire length to be a matter of millimeters. At the bottom is a room. Rough walls, uneven floor, nothing in it. And in the floor of that room is a pit, cut downward, that stops for no reason. In the wall is a horizontal passage that runs about 16 meters into the rock and simply ends. The standard explanation is abandonment. The builders changed their minds, moved the plan upward, and walked away from the underground work. But that explanation has a problem, and the problem is the descending passage itself. That passage is the most precisely cut long feature in the entire complex. It was carved through bedrock before the pyramid above it existed. If the underground chamber was a discarded first draft, the builders discarded it after executing the single most demanding piece of alignment work on the site, and then continued to build the entire pyramid on top of it while leaving the passage open and accessible. You do not do that with a mistake. You do that with something you intend to keep reaching. Now, bring in the historian. Around 450 BCE, a Greek traveler visited Egypt and wrote down what the priests told him about the Great Pyramid. He recorded that the underground chambers were built on a kind of island, surrounded by water brought in from the river through a channel. That was dismissed as a tall tale for 2,000 years. There is no island under the Great Pyramid, but there is one on the plateau. A few hundred meters away, along the causeway of the second pyramid, there is a shaft. It descends in 3 stages, roughly 30 meters into the bedrock. The lowest level holds a chamber cut with square pillars, and in the center of that chamber sits a massive granite box. And the bottom level floods. It sits at the water table. When it was properly cleared and pumped in the late 1990s, the excavation team had to remove standing water to reach the floor. A chamber cut deep under the plateau, containing a stone box, standing on a platform surrounded by water. The Greek traveler was not inventing a fable. He was describing something real that existed on the plateau, and it was rediscovered and documented more than 2,000 years after he wrote it down. If he was right about that, the question becomes obvious. What else in those accounts was a plain description that we have been reading as poetry? Because there is one more thing under the pyramid, and it is not a chamber. It is a property. In 2018, a research group split between a physics university in Russia and a laser institute in Germany published a study in a mainstream applied physics journal. They were not doing archaeology. They were doing electromagnetics. They modeled the Great Pyramid as a physical object and calculated how it interacts with radio waves in the range of roughly 200 to 600 meters in wavelength. The result was that the structure behaves as a resonator. At specific frequencies, the geometry concentrates electromagnetic energy in 2 places: inside the internal chambers and in the substrate directly beneath the base. The authors were careful. They stated plainly that the ancient builders could not have known about radio waves, and that this is a consequence of the shape and the material, not evidence of intent. That caveat is correct, and it should be taken seriously. But the finding itself is real, peer-reviewed, and reproducible. Whatever the builders intended, the object they built focuses energy into the ground underneath itself. And the ground underneath is exactly where they cut a 100-meter passage to a chamber they left unfinished, on a plateau whose name means the mouth of the passages. Here is where it gets strange. The acoustic behavior is just as odd. The granite chamber at the heart of the pyramid resonates. Sound engineers who have measured it report that the room has a pronounced low-frequency response, a fundamental in the range human hearing barely registers, felt in the chest more than heard in the ears. The stone box in that room rings when struck. The corbelled grand gallery, with its stepped, overlapping walls climbing 8 meters upward, is shaped in a way that would be at home in a concert hall and has no structural necessity at that scale. Take those three together. A geometry that concentrates energy underneath itself. A chamber that resonates. A gallery shaped like a waveguide. And beneath all of it, a network of cut passages descending into bedrock and groundwater. None of that proves the pyramid was a machine, but it means the building does things. And a structure that does things is a very different object from a marker over a burial. The 2023 discovery made the pattern worse. Above the original entrance, on the north face, there is an arrangement of enormous limestone blocks, set at an angle, forming a chevron. It has been visible to every visitor for 4,500 years. It was assumed to be a weight-distributing feature over the doorway. The scans found a corridor behind it, 9 meters long, 2 meters wide, 2 meters high, sitting between 17 and 23 meters above ground level. Nobody knew, not the Romans, not the medieval expeditions that tumbled into the pyramid looking for treasure, not the surveyors, not the Egyptologists. It was confirmed by 3 independent methods, and then, in early 2023, a team threaded an endoscope through a joint between the stones and photographed the inside. A finished corridor. Empty. Its function is still officially unknown. And this is where the institutional part of the story starts to look less like coincidence. The engineer whose robot found the metal pins lost his access after the footage became public. The follow-up robot mission photographed the markings and the looped pins and then quietly wound down. The most recent scanning results have been announced through press conferences and book fairs, rather than published simultaneously in full. In late 2025, the most prominent archaeologist working the plateau told an audience at a conference in Sharjah that scanning had located a 30-meter corridor inside the pyramid, that robots had been used to reach and clean openings no human could get to, and that the contents of the discovery would not be revealed until 2026. Read that again. The contents were located. They were not disclosed. That is not a conspiracy. Excavation permits are slow. National heritage law is strict, and controlled announcements are normal practice for a country where these monuments are a primary economic asset. All of that is true. It is also true that the world's most studied building keeps producing spaces nobody predicted, that the physical leads inside it get opened by a few millimeters and then paused, and that the pattern is now repeated 4 times across 3 decades. Meanwhile, the scanning has spread. In late 2025, the same project turned its instruments on the smallest of the 3 main pyramids at Giza, using ground-penetrating radar, ultrasound, and electrical resistivity tomography on a strangely polished section of the eastern face. They found 2 air-filled cavities just behind the surface, roughly a meter or so deep, and reported that the long-suspected second entrance on that side is now very plausible. 3 pyramids, 4 confirmed unknown spaces, and the instruments have only been pointed at a fraction of the plateau. So now the honest question. Does any of this prove there is lost technology under the Great Pyramid? No, it does not. And the grounded version deserves a fair hearing because it is not boring. The most likely explanation for the big void is architectural, a construction relief space or an internal ramp system used to raise the heavy blocks, left in place because filling it in served no purpose. That theory was proposed years before the void was found, by a French architect who argued the pyramid was built from the inside using a spiral internal ramp. If he is right, the void is not a chamber. It is the scaffolding still inside the building. The granite tool marks almost certainly come from copper saws and tube drills fed with quartz sand, a method that has been reproduced. The precision comes from time, organization, and an obsessive quality control culture, not from unknown machines. The ancient cedar was probably reused old timber. The resonance is a consequence of a large hollow stone structure, not evidence of design intent. The electromagnetics paper says so explicitly in its own text, and the underground chamber is very likely exactly what it appears to be. An early plan abandoned when the design changed. But hold on. Even the fully grounded version is extraordinary. It means a Bronze Age society without iron, without pulleys as we know them, without writing that was more than a few centuries old, planned a structure with a base covering more than 5 hectares, leveled its foundation to within about 2 centimeters across that entire footprint, aligned its sides to true north to within a fraction of a degree, quarried, and moved 80-ton granite beams 800 kilometers, and built the whole thing to tolerances that modern construction crews with laser levels struggle to match. They did it once. They did not build up to it over centuries of trial and error. The Great Pyramid appears near the beginning of the tradition, not at the end of it. That is the real mystery, and it does not require anything from the sky to be astonishing. But the grounded version still leaves the holes. It does not explain a slab with metal pins looped on the hidden side 60 meters up a shaft that goes nowhere. It does not explain why a corridor was hidden behind the chevron for 4,500 years and left empty. It does not explain why the most precisely cut passage on the site leads to a room that was supposedly abandoned. And it does not explain why the contents of a 2026 announcement were located and then withheld. If even one of those spaces contains something, our understanding of the Fourth Dynasty changes. Not because it would prove visitors from elsewhere, but because it would mean the people who built this were operating with knowledge, methods, and intentions we have not recovered. Knowledge that was written into stone instead of onto papyrus, because stone is the only medium that survives 5,000 years. And if that's true, it means our history is missing a chapter, not a footnote. A chapter covering the transition from scattered villages to a civilization capable of the largest precision engineering project on the planet. A transition that in the record appears to happen almost overnight. The Egyptians called the plateau the mouth of the passages. They wrote about a sealed region beneath the ground that the living were not meant to enter. We assumed they were describing a spiritual landscape. Then we pointed particle detectors at it and found a void nobody could account for. Then we found a corridor behind the entrance. Then we found the cavities under the eastern face of the third pyramid. They weren't guessing. They were recording. The void above the Grand Gallery has never been entered. The chamber behind the pinned slab has been photographed through a hole the width of a pencil and nothing more. The corridor behind the chevron is empty and unexplained. The passage under the pyramid still runs 100 meters down into bedrock and stops at a room with a pit that goes nowhere. And somewhere in the paperwork of a ministry in Cairo, there is a file describing what a robot found inside the Great Pyramid. And it has not been opened to the public. 4,500 years, 23 million blocks, 6 million tons of stone. And we have never seen the inside of the largest room in it. It is still there, it is still sealed, and whatever is inside has been waiting in the dark longer than any written language has existed. If you want the next piece of this, the investigation continues on screen now.